Lord Fuller.
My Lords, I rise to move Amendments 67, 73, 104 and 105, standing in my name on the marshalled list. Might I say at the outset, this is my first set of amendments I've brought to your Lordship's House, and on that basis, if I make some small procedural missteps, so please treat me gently. Now, the purpose of this set of amendments is to protect the best and most versatile land for food production. Now, that's not to say that solar or renewables are intrinsically bad. It's just that solar and renewable energy should be focused on the poorer land and food production on the best. Having needed to dig for victory within living memory, we can't afford to forget that food in your belly ranks above having a roof over your head in the hierarchy of needs. It's the most basic needs. I'm not seeking to be obstructionist, but we have to recognise that we're a crowded island and we all have to eat, and you can't eat a solar panel. There are plenty of calls on land use, for housing, for water management, for drainage, amenity, environment, for factories, transport uses, and of course food production. And this amendment seeks to balance the tension between energy and food production, and it can't be left to an operationally independent private company, GB Energy, to the directors, who have no concern for food, to get carried away and undermine the food security of our nation. And it's because of these tensions that the last government proposed a land use framework so we can strike the right balance between competing land uses. And I know we're still waiting for that to be published by this government, who have exhibited quite a cavalier disregard for anything that happens in the sticks, unless they can cover it with concrete or carpet it with panels. Now, at this stage, I should declare my interest as a director of companies involved in the agricultural supply industry and the farming industries. But this isn't about my personal interest. Protecting the best and most valuable land is in the national interest, and I'm not alone in stating this. The noble Baroness, the Minister Lady Hayman, talks about food security being national security, and I agree. And put simply, the UK is not self-sufficient in food and continues to rely on the kindness of strangers to feed it. And it's important, because last November I asked a written question about how many hectares of solar farms were being considered under the NSIP regime. And the answer came back: there were about 2 farms covering 1,400 hectares under consideration. Oh, I know in Norfolk alone there are 7,000 hectares and 5 schemes. And it's the same elsewhere. The government has simply lost control of the numbers on renewables. It's unsighted on the stampede to take our best land out of production and lock it away for a generation. There's an unthinking dash for renewables, overlaid by a reckless indifference about one of our largest industries, the food industry, the backbone of private enterprise on our shores. Now, GB Energy has no concern for any of this, but it should. And that gets to the heart of why these amendments are needed on the face of the bill. We cannot afford to be careless with our food supply. Last year, national wheat yield was down 25%, from over 14 million tonnes to about 11. And it's partly explained by bad weather, but also because so much productive land was temporarily placed into environmental schemes. There was a herd effect. I'm pleased to say that plantings have bounced back this season, but that 25% reduction should serve as a warning about the fragility of our food supply. My Lords, a casual approach to land use materially affected our ability to feed ourselves before anyone even realised. As I say, the cultivated land has bounced back this year, but the damage has been repaired. But when land is converted to solar, it isn't locked away for one season, it's locked away for 30 years, a whole generation. And that's consequential. We can't accidentally sleepwalk into locking away our best land. It needs a more planned approach. And that's why we need directions. Now, I'm grateful to your Lordship's Library for providing me with the best estimate of the different types of farmed land here in the UK. In essence, the Library tells me that of land under cultivation and grazing, Natural England estimates that under the classification system established in 1966, about 21% of the land is grade 1 and 2, and 21% of the upper end of good grade 3, the best and most versatile land. If we make an allowance for the lower end of grade 3, I'd suggest, my Lords, that about half the 8.9 million hectares of farmed land in England could be classified as the most productive and worthy of protection. And that's the land as the subject of these amendments. I'm not going to dwell on the difficulties the Library tells me they had in collating this information. But if we just accept, and be gentle with me, that there's about half the land is grade 1, 2 and 3, the best land, that would still earmark about 4.5 million hectares for non-users, including renewables. Now, I'm going to refrain from describing this vast area, 4.5 million hectares, in the traditional unit of measure, which is probably football pitches. But I venture to say that 4.5 million hectares is about 2 Waleses or 9 Norfolks. I've heard it said that the amount of land that could be devoted to solar, even in the most adventurous scenario, is probably no larger than the area devoted to the UK's golf courses. But that's to miss the point. If indeed the coverage is much less than 1%, well, then there's nothing to fear from protecting the best land. In other words, if my amendment is accepted, there'll still be plenty of land for renewables on the worst land, just not on the places where the best land feeds us. Now, let's move on to the economics. Thanks to this government, the public now starts to realise how farmers work in difficult conditions to eke out a precarious existence in a risky enterprise buffeted by weather and global trade issues. And the reward for all this effort is often just about £200 an acre, often having invested millions in productive plant and equipment like sprayers, tractors and combines. And these farmers are being offered about £900 per acre to sit on the beach with no risk, index-linked income streams for 40 years, giving up farming and installing panels on their land. There are whispers that, should they do this after a passage of time, that land would then be zoned as previously developed land, rather than farmland, and be worth considerably more as a result. So you can't blame landowners for seeking to convert for solar, except some landowners want to turf their tenants off, and that's no good. It's a completely rational thing to accept, and it's completely in their private interest to do so. But, my lords, this amendment recognises that whilst it may be in their private interest, it's not in the national interest. We can't have a situation where it's open season for renewables, regardless to the wider consequences. Now, the state exists to arbitrate between the private and the public interest, and I say we cannot be cavalier or careless with our food supply. However much we crave clean energy, we need to strike the balance between eating and heating. And what that means is that ensuring food is preferentially produced on grades 1 and 2, whilst accepting grades 4 and 5 can contribute in other ways. Now, that's the way forward. Now, that said, even where grades 4 and 5 land could be contemplated for renewable energy, it's often the case that while some of this is impaired in agricultural terms, it has other values. And some of those values may include amenity value, outstanding landscape value, or contribute to a wider social benefit, perhaps in an area of natural beauty. And it's for this reason, even in cases where land may be at the poorer end of the production, changes to use of solar or renewables should be consulted on by residents within a 20-mile buffer of the widest proposed land escape, and my Amendment 104 provides for this stipulation. Taken together, my amendments seek to establish and enforce the balance and the tension between the private and the public interest. And that's what the state's for. It's there to protect us from the herd effect that can stampede a whole industry in a direction of farming before it can be appreciated what's happening, as we saw last spring. Now, I want to talk about why it's important that GB Energy is constrained by these amendments on the face of the bill. And that's partly because no one in the countryside is prepared to take anything on trust from this government going forward. Labour doesn't really understand the countryside, but I tell you, my lords, the countryside understands Labour. Great Britain is a company. There's to be a fiduciary board. There are duties under the Companies Act 2006 to produce its self-interest, the private interest. And the Secretary of State should be empowered by the bill to make certain directions, but we wouldn't need these amendments if the nature of those directions were already on the face of the bill. Left uncontrolled, we shouldn't be surprised if GB Energy acts as the company law requires, in the best interest of the company, not the public interest of the country. And it's not scaremongering. I mean, it is what we've just seen, having spent hours and hours and hours debating the water bill. So there is precedent, for wanting to have these sort of controls. My amendments will require the Secretary of State to ensure that GB Energy focus their activities in such a way as to not undermine our food security, our national security, to act in the widest national interest, not to pursue its own private interest. There is no such requirement, so it falls on us to ensure that there is. Now, moving on, my amendments are important for another reason, and I want to dwell on an economic reason why this amendment is so important. I refer to the nature of the contracts being offered to farmers to incentivise to give up food production and sit on the beach. Long-term, state-backed secure income streams that are index-linked, underpinned by a physical asset in a country with strong property and commercial rights. And these are the sorts of investments that pension funds around the world seek out. The parcelling, packaging and collateralising of such assets into derivatives is what Wall Street thrives on. But if we do not apply limits, we risk the perverse incentive that would convert much more than 1% of the land, a huge amount of land, of the British countryside into nothing more than a global energy play, with the benefits transferred to offshore territories controlled from who knows where. The countryside isn't there to be collateralised, so GB Energy should be directed to give preference to the hard graft and toil by the farmers on the best land who feed us, rather than drive the countryside in the direction of providing passive income for global investors elsewhere. Failure to accept these amendments would be a policy designed to kill the family farm even faster than the government is planning to do so already, and transfer control of much of the countryside to Wall Street, whilst British jobs, proper jobs, and real family businesses are greenwashed out of existence. Rural Britain would be rinsed unless we get a grip here. It's the landscape, with its landscape and environment impaired. My Lords, to summarise, the stampede for solar is economically rational for individual farmers, but economically illiterate for the countryside and our environment. It isn't a matter of food energy versus energy security. I know we need to keep the lights on, but we've all got to eat. And food security and energy security can and should be bedfellows. And this amendment provides a sensible framework where they can both live alongside each other in the national interest and with the consent of those most directly affected by the installations. So, in essence, GB Energy should be directed and required by statute to prevent a modern version of the Highland clearances on the lowland in an unthinking and unconscious dash for renewals on our best land. GB Energy can't have operational independence over our food supply without limit or regard to consequence. So I ask the Minister, why would they be against this when, under my proposal, we could still have 9 Norfolks or 2 Wales's worth of land to go at, but at least we have the security of food in our bellies? I beg to move.
Question.